Let me say that there are plenty of people who live constantly under the threat of terrorism. If you want to find them, go to Yemen or North Waziristan, where people don't have to be told about terrorism. They are constantly in fear that 5 minutes from now, the guy across the street is going to be blown away along with anybody else who happens to be around. That's massive global terrorism. And it has repercussions. And we're seeing some of the repercussions. What happened in Brussels was a monstrous terrorist act. But it's worth looking at the explanation that was given for it. ISIS took credit for it and issued a statement which basically said, as long as you keep bombing us, we're going to respond by attacking you. There's something to that. There's a real problem, but the answer, and we have to make a decision as to how to deal with it. One decision we can make is to follow the playbook that Al-Qaeda and ISIS have presented and want us to follow. Namely, and they're very explicit about it. Destroy your own societies, destroy your own freedom and liberty, and get into a war with the Muslim world. That's their playbook. We can accept that if we like. We've been doing it for 15 years. If you go back 15 years to the launching of the so-called war on terror, terrorism, what we call terrorism, was located in a tiny area of tribal areas of what we call AFPAC, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Where is it now? All over the world. Every time you hit it with a sledgehammer, it expands. The invasion of Iraq, for example, one of the effects was that in the year following it, terrorism increased by a factor of 7. Intelligence agencies had predicted that it would lead to more terror, but it was way beyond. And that continues. There's another possibility, and that is to try to get to the roots and the causes of it and try to deal with them. It's not dramatic and exciting, but it would work. And there's plenty of research that tells us why people turn to terrorism. Take Brussels or Paris. The terrorist acts are carried out by people who lived and grew up there in slums, miserable suburbs, young people who lived with humiliation, degradation, no hope, some from countries in North Africa where they'd been subjected to brutal European atrocities for centuries. Young people who wanted something in their lives. They wanted some dignity, some hope, some excitement, something to look forward to. They were not going to find it in their own societies. So most of them had very little background in Islam. They picked up Islam. This gave them a cause, okay? We can increase that by following the ISIS playbook, or you could look at the causes for it and try to deal with them. Take a look at the British in Northern Ireland. Terrorism in England was pretty serious for a long time, much more than it is now. Fortunately, they didn't react by carpet bombing Northern Ireland, following Ted Cruz's proposal. They finally, after a long period of doing the wrong thing, reacting with violence, they began to consider the reasons and the causes and to deal with them. And didn't turn into a paradise, but it's a big difference. I was in Belfast in 1993, and it was a war zone, literally. I was there 15 years later. It was, you could see tensions, but it was a pretty normal city. And some of the people who had been hitmen for the IRA were now part of the negotiating teams. That's the way you deal with it if you want to end the terrorism. If you want to follow the playbook outlined by Osama bin Laden and his successors, then hit it with a sledgehammer.
And I just want to make one point about terrorism itself, and Professor Chomsky made all the key points. But what's really remarkable to me is I've had the misfortune, because I was traveling this week throughout the U.S., of being subjected to what I typically try really hard to avoid, which is watching cable news. And what's amazing is, they had like wall-to-wall coverage of every minute aspect of this terrorist attack in Brussels, and they had like all their famous TV correspondents in their really chic overcoats being deployed to Brussels, walking around like all investigative and whatever. All those actors who play the role of journalists on TV, they're all in Brussels. And for everything that they talked about, the one question that literally was never asked is, what was the motive in why terrorists decided to sacrifice their own lives and kill people in Belgium? Like, why would they do that? It was just assumed these are savages and barbaric monsters with this primitive, inscrutable religion. I've lived in Brazil for the last 10 years. Brazil is a non-Muslim country, overwhelmingly Catholic and evangelical. It's also a free and open and democratic society. There's never any talk about Muslims targeting Brazil. The same is true in Japan or Korea or Argentina or Chile or dozens of democratic non-Muslim countries around the world. Why is that? Is it that the terrorists just put the names of all the countries into a paper bag and like randomly pull the ones out and that they're going to attack? Or is there something that is true about the governments and policies of the countries they attack that is causing them to become targets? And there's tons of evidence, as Professor Chomsky said, but just go to Google and Google 2004 Rumsfeld report on terrorism. Because Donald Rumsfeld in 2004 asked this question. He said, why are there so many people who hate the United States so much that they're willing to give up their own lives to attack and kill Americans? And the answer that Donald Rumsfeld's commission said was, it said, you know what, these people, they don't hate us for our freedoms, and they don't hate us because they're involved in a religious war or because they have this religion that hypnotizes them into committing violence. They hate us because of our policies. Overwhelming support for Israel, occupying and bombing their countries, killing their children, propping up their dictators. And so, as Professor Chomsky said, we can continue to engage in those policies that our own government says in secret causes terrorism, or if we're really serious about stopping it, we don't need to spend tens of billions of dollars and tell the government to spy on us. We can ask ourselves, what is it that we can be doing differently that lessens that desire and dilutes and weakens that infrastructure?
If I can just add a word, that report was quite interesting, and particularly interesting was that it was a repeat of a National Security Council document from 1958, when that's one of the advantages of living in a free society where you can get declassified documents. President Eisenhower in 1958 asked his staff, why is there a campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, not from the governments, but from the populations? And there happened to be a National Security Council study that came out that year, which gave the answer. It said there is a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports brutal and dictatorial regimes and blocks democracy and development, and that we do it because we want to make sure we can control their resources and their policies. And then it said these perceptions are more or less accurate, but we should continue doing it because that's in our interest. So the Rumsfeld report is repeating what we should know and what the victims do know. They don't have to read secret documents to find out.